that I have and I hold dear, as well as registration for our local 5K. And our local congressman came over and participated in that with us. So the political engagement is happening, but again, at least 2/3 of the Muslim community are immigrants, so it's going to take a little bit of time. Community building. Now, community building doesn't have to be that you sit them in a mosque and tell them to be good Muslims. It could be basketball games. It could be, for example, where I'm coming from, we have kids show up for basketball at a certain time. That's a time when they are socializing publicly. We all know what's going on, and that's when, maybe when it's prayer time, they will go and then they will listen to the leaders speaking about things that are actually religion, not what they learn on the internet. Identity politics, that's happening more as the kids who were born and raised in this country from immigrant parents are coming of age. This is a very complicated model. And this is from our latest meeting with the group of advancements of psychiatry. I put that in there, but I don't think that I'll have time to talk about that here. And certainly we can talk about that later if anybody has any interest. So I think that's my last slide. You guys have been great. Nobody slept. I was checking. That's pretty good.
Thank you. Steve. I'm jealous. Their slides are much nicer than mine. I have my best friend Jem and I have probably lectured at over 300 universities in US and Canada and Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and every time we're in a room like this or an auditorium, Jim's a bright guy. He has 4 PhDs. He always tells me, you only have 2, keep working, and you'll become educated sometime. But every time we're in something like this, he says, you know what the origin of the word auditorium is? I went, oh no, here we go again. He says it comes from 2 words, audio, or meaning to hear, and Taurus, which means bull. I will try not to fulfill that definition tonight. A few weeks ago, when we heard about the tragedy, and I'm going to come back to that, but I had a flashback to 1979, and you're all much younger than I am, so you probably don't remember 79. I was in graduate school, probably drinking a little too much, and I do remember being on a table, I don't know how to get there, and I was singing God Bless America, and at least it was a patriotic song, thank God. And suddenly I heard some news about some hostages being taken in Iran, right? Do you remember that? And we would turn CNN on every night because we didn't have those other 2 channels. And so that would have been very interesting to hear them report on that, right? But you remember every day it was counting down, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger, and our hearts just kept sinking deeper and deeper. And I was so excited when I heard that the wise men in Washington, and I'm not making fun of them, but the wise men in Washington had gotten together and they said, we need to find a Muslim leader who has the stature and moral authority to intervene with the Ayatollah Khomeini on behalf of the hostages. Nice thought. And so they got together and they're thinking and they're thinking and they're thinking. They finally came up with the name Sayyid Maulana Maududi. Nice choice, right? He was loved by Sunnis and Muslims. That name may not be familiar to some of you, but it is very familiar to me. And interesting character. He's written some interesting stuff. It just so happened that Maududi had died 3 months before that in a hospital in Ohio. The entire Muslim world was grieving the loss of him, and we didn't know. And so for me, that's what makes this valuable, this kind of setting, right? Where we inform ourselves about what's going on in each other's communities, whatever the religion or non-religion. You know, we need to know what's going on in the world, because there we wasted an opportunity, and it went on for what, 444 days before that got settled. Back to Boston. When I heard that tragedy, again, my heart sunk and I went, oh no, please don't let it be a Muslim, right? And that took me back to 1995. You remember Oklahoma City? As soon as we heard the news, before we even knew who it was, they were broadcasting that this must have been Muslim terrorist. Just so happens it was a nice little Roman Catholic boy, Timothy McVeigh, who actually served in the Gulf War. He was a Gulf War veteran, but who became politically riled by what he thought was the government's bungling in Waco, Texas, right? And so he lashed out at the government by attacking a government building, right? Then I thought of another young man, Anders Breivik, you know, in Oslo, Norway in 2011. Not a Muslim, but someone who shot and killed 91 individuals, they give different numbers on this one, who was a fundamentalist Christian, who was posting hateful messages about Muslims on the internet, right? And not a Muslim. And so as I had this in my mind, it had me go back to the stats, and I'm not a statistics kind of person. I majored in philosophy, which means I don't deal with reality, and psychology. I collect money from those who don't deal with reality, okay? And so, or at least it disturbs them. Actually, I majored in philosophy so that when I got married, I would be able to lay on the couch. And if my wife said, "What are you doing?" I would say, I'm working. I'm thinking deep thoughts. She didn't buy it. But I thought of the data on terrorism, and so I was looking at this data and I think you had mentioned some of this data, and I'm not going to belabor this, but between 1970 and 2012, about 2,400 terrorist acts. And you know, here, what counts as an act of terrorism, people don't always agree on, so the stats are going to be kind of different, right? But these are on US soil. Among that number, about 60 were carried out by Muslims, supposedly. And so that accounted for about 2.4% of all the terrorist attacks. When we get down to the data, it's interesting that a huge number of those were attacks on abortion clinics, mostly done by, you know, people who are upset by, deeply upset by abortions, many of them fundamentalist Christians. 120 of those bombings were by a paramilitary Puerto Rican group. I saw the name and went, I never even heard of that name, right? 28% of all terrorists were motivated by single issues, such as animal rights or opposition to war. 11%, only 11% were religiously motivated, and that's across all religions. So it's kind of like Anders Breivik and Timothy McVeigh and all of these. It means terrorism is not a Muslim phenomenon. It's a human phenomenon. And as humans, I think we all qualify. My wife may have doubts, but I think we're all concerned about whoever's doing this and what can we do to begin to lower that number. Like that precious little boy's picture, no more hurting people. We all want that. And those of us in Connecticut desperately want that kind of thing, to stop. I want to cover some of the myths and realities about terrorism. Everybody, in psychology, we have this term called confirmatory bias. We all have experienced it. Confirmatory bias means that once you have an idea in your head or a belief, you go looking for data that confirms that, right? For example, when I hit midlife and had my midlife crisis, I formed the belief that I desperately needed a little red sports car. Actually, it was a motorcycle, but my wife calls them murder cycles, so I'm not getting one of those. Although she opened the possibility for me, I have to tell you this. I know better than to let her know I want a motorcycle, but one day I was at CVS in Unionville. It was a beautiful day, and there was this Harley right in front of me. And I stopped, but I knew not to look at it too long, otherwise I'd get a lecture. And about that time, this young guy comes out of an exercise place with shoulders like this and a waist like this, and she goes, "Honey, when you look like that, you can have a motorcycle." I called her a terrorist. Terrorism attacks, confirmatory bias says, you know, we look for data that confirms the bias. When I wanted to buy the little red sports car, I started seeing little red sports cars everywhere. They've always been there, but because I was looking for it, right? I had that idea, I'm looking for it. And because we're heightened to think that terrorism is everywhere, we're looking for data to confirm that, despite the fact that the data is against that acts of terrorism in America have gone down significantly over time. Other myth, most terrorist attacks in the US have an international origin and are perpetrated by Muslims. Well, no, most terrorist attacks have no connection with the Middle East. Most are homegrown. We're fully capable of doing it on our own. Now, doesn't mean that there aren't sometimes some connections with some ideologies that come from elsewhere, ideologies that we wish we didn't have to contend with, right? But let's keep the myth and the reality straight. Myth, the United States has one of the highest rates of terrorism in the world. No, actually, we've experienced relatively less terrorism than any other country. We are actually fairly safe, other than deaths by guns, a fairly safe country. Myth that terrorism is usually politically motivated. No. You know, now this we get into a definitional issue, because some organizations only count acts of terrorism that are more politically motivated as terrorism, otherwise it doesn't get called. Well, if you do that, then of course 100% would be politically motivated. But if you look at the alleged motivations, most are not political in nature. Causes of it, American Psychological Association, I was talking to a psychologist who has really, I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, he's psychodynamic, he's the enemy. But he's such a nice guy, I listen to him. And so he is always looking at the motivations, and he always wants to look for childhood, because he loves Freud. I like to know what's going on in your head in the here and the now. That fight will go on forever, okay?